Hey everybody, Pastor Daniel from Woodlands Church, back at you, coming back with video number 2 on life-giving relationships. Just a quick reminder where all this comes from. We are learning about Saul's life and how Saul eventually becomes Paul. But during these weeks and years of transformation, which happened in Acts chapter 9 of Saul's life, Saul goes from destroyer of the church to a participant, a fellow member of the church, a valued and beloved member of the church. And so as we've been unpacking Acts chapter 9, we have been taking a deep dive into what biblical, Christ-centered, God-honoring relationships look like. And in the first video, we talked about the foundations of Christian relationship. If we want life-giving, life-saving, life-changing relationship, what are the foundations for those things? Like, what are the pillars that hold that sort of relationship up? This is video number 2. We're going to talk about how to form life-giving relationships, right? So we're going to get a little bit more into the practicality of relationships within the church, these life-giving relationships. How do we begin to form these things? And number 1 is this, and I think it's probably the biggest one, just to kind of break the ice. Number 1 is this: we have to take risks. Any new relationship that we've ever formed, any friendship, whether it's been a romantic relationship or just a friendship or a deep relationship inside of the church, it's always happened because at some point we've taken a risk. We've taken a risk to enter a new relationship. We've taken a risk to enter a small group. We've taken a risk to invite someone over for dinner or to enter somebody else's home for dinner, right? Like at some point there was a risk there. And I think what's important to note is that nothing worthwhile is ever easy. And so if every relationship in your life has been easy and it's been easy to enter, which is unlikely, right? But if it's been easy, then it's probably not been all that worthwhile, right? Hard things are typically the things of most value. And I think the same is true inside of relationship. And number 1, when we're talking about how to form and how to begin life-giving relationships, well, the first thing is we have to take a risk. We have to enter that home of that person for the first time. We have to start going to that small group. We have to start serving in the church. We have to invite those people over to our house. We have to take a risk, right? And this is kind of counterintuitive for us today because our world tells us that everything we should be concerned about we should be concerned about and obsessed with safety and comfort. But you see, we aren't part of that world. And that part of our culture that we live in, that American culture that's obsessed with safety and comfort, that's not of God's world. And so we are not of this. We do not live in this world. This is not our home, right? The kingdom of God is our home, and God's word is our guide. And I think you can't hardly turn a page of the Bible without finding a man or a woman who took great risks for others, right? I mean, you could just go through a list: Noah and the ark, David and Goliath, Gideon is 300, Moses and Pharaoh. And then you see this in Jesus' life over and over again, just risk after risk after risk after risk. And the risk is typically always about other people, right? These great men and women of the faith that we see from the Old Testament to the New Testament, they're almost always taking a risk on behalf of someone else. And so I think it's important that we always are looking for that opportunity to take a risk, to invite relationship into our lives. And, here's something to chew on a little bit. Every risk that we take won't pay off. And that's just the way this world works. We understand that, right? Like we could take 10 risks, maybe 5 of them pay off good and 5 of them don't turn out well. But let me tell you this, when it comes to relationship, you take that risk within God's family, you take that risk within God's church to build godly, deep, abiding, life-giving relationship. I assure you that God will be faithful in that, and that God will give you the sorts of relationship that you desire. So how to form life-giving relationship? Number 1, take a risk. Number 2, we have to be willing to ask hard questions. One of the things that definitely happens in most of our friendships is they just end up in this perpetual state of being shallow, stuck, and stagnant. Why is that? Because we just stay surface level. Why? Going back to what I said, because everything at surface level is safe, right? Like sharing things about a broken down car, or a leaky roof, or a sick pet, or a sick relative, or something like that. Like those things are real and they're part of my life, but they're just on the surface. And if that's where I stay for the rest of my life, all of my relationships are going to be shallow, stuck, and stagnant. And so the way we get out of that is we learn to ask hard questions, right? We learn to ask questions of people that take us a little bit deeper. And you don't have to go from here, shallow, surface level, all the way to the depths, but you can go step by step by step by asking questions that are a little bit harder and pry a little bit deeper. And I would encourage you, don't always settle for easy answers. Challenge those you're in relationship with to answer in a real, raw, and authentic way, to answer in a way that's deeper than we expect. You see, if we want these sorts of relationships that are heart-changing, that become lifelong, that become life-giving, we have to be willing to ask the hard question. And I like to talk about this in like a 90-10 paradigm, right? Like I think most of our relationships, we're willing to share, at least most of our deep relationships and lifelong relationships, we're willing to share about 90% of ourselves, right? But there's that 10% that we probably hold on to in secret for most of our lives. You know, that's where we need to push into by asking hard questions. Push into that area where no one's gone before and talk about things that have never been talked about before. And those are the places where we're going to see that sort of sharing, that sort of authenticity really stir in our hearts, both our hearts and our friend's heart, the people we're in relationship with, and we're going to really see God work. And by the way, that's also where camaraderie, brotherhood, and sisterhood is birthed. It's birthed in that 10%, right? As we're sharing that hardest 10% of our life, you know what's going to happen? Brotherhood, sisterhood, camaraderie is going to be built because those people that we share with are going to know something about us, we're going to know something about them, and we're going to realize that we're not that different and that we share a lot of similarities and that we've both walked through some very hard things. But understand that this sort of relationship, this sort of camaraderie, brotherhood, sisterhood, it only happens not only when you ask hard questions, but number 3, you have to be willing to answer hard questions, right? Like it's one thing to ask a question and then you can stay here, right? Surface level, right? The way to go deeper is for you yourself first, being willing to set the example to go deeper. And so we have to be first willing to answer hard questions. And by the way, what this does is it doesn't just align us in brotherhood, sisterhood, and camaraderie. We don't just learn the similarities about the things we've walked through in life, but you know what it's really doing? It's building this bridge of trust, right? And any good relationship, as I talked about in the first video, is built on extreme trust. And so we have to be willing to answer hard questions. And what that does is that just grows our relationship. It grows trust. It grows authenticity. It grows the environment where we feel safe. And it grows really the time and the places where God can do great work in the midst of that relationship. And just 2 more quick things when we're talking about asking good questions and answering good questions. We have to move past the place where we deflect sharing, right? And what I mean by this is oftentimes in a small group setting, or even just in a casual setting, or having lunch with someone, or grabbing a cup of coffee with someone, oftentimes we can be asked a hard question, but we deflect the answer. And what I mean by that is we oftentimes end up sharing stories, details, maybe even intimate details about someone else rather than ourselves. And one of our rules at Woodlands Church within relationship is that when we answer questions, when we share, we always use I statements or me statements, right? We don't say anything about them or us or they. We talk about me. We talk about I. And so don't deflect when you're sharing. Don't talk about your spouse. Don't talk about your neighbor. Don't talk about your other friend. share about yourself. See, deflective sharing, it can cause us to share things about others, which really becomes deceptive, right? Because all of a sudden it feels like we're sharing something deep about ourselves, but really we're deceiving our friend, we're deceiving that person we're in a relationship with, because we're not sharing about us and what God is doing in us and about our past, our present, our future, but we're sharing about someone else. And so those are the points when we talk about forming life-giving relationships, right? So you want to form life-giving relationships. Number 1, take a risk. Number 2, ask hard questions. Number 3, answer hard questions. Don't share shallow. Don't deflect your answers. Share about yourself. All right, so we're two videos in now we've talked about the foundations of life-giving relationships. We've talked about how to begin to form life-giving relationships. And in video number 3, we're going to tackle something even a bit harder, right? What do we do when we've messed up? What do we do when we stumbled? What do we do when we've failed in the midst of relationship, right? Because even if we do all of these things right that I've talked to up to this point, we know that the reality is we're flesh, we're sinful human beings. And so what do we do when we've made an error, when we've sinned against someone, when we've hurt someone? That'll be in video number 3 coming out soon.